We would like to have, let's see, back there, there's a light switch there, I think. Can we turn the, thank you very much, Liz. All right. So this afternoon, this morning, just seems like afternoon. We're privileged to have Dr. Jacques Ducan with us, who is an authority on the book of Genesis. And so we're looking forward to what he has to say. Is it Genesis 1 and 2? Is that? Yes, exegesis of Genesis 1 and 2. A great topic you're going to really appreciate. So let's just go ahead and get started, and if they miss it, that's their loss. All right. Well, maybe we should call them in. All right, we'll pray. We'll pray for him. All right, as we are prepared to begin, let's begin with a word of prayer, if I may. Loving Father, we thank you that you've given us the opportunity to study your word. We pray that you'll open our hearts, be with us, that we will receive what you have for us. Please bless the speakers. And as we start, please bless Jacques as he goes. In Jesus' name, amen.
Little instrument I have. All right, so you are listening. You can hear me now. Thank you. All right. Let me just start with the... Am I right? Okay. Let me just start with a question which I always ask before we do an exegetical assignment. You know, anytime I start teaching, I still do when I teach once in a while. Before we open the scriptures, I have a bit of a prelude, and I have 10 principles. I'm just connect to what you just heard before me here. I mean, from Wendy Jackson, you know, talking about understanding the scriptures. Now we are getting to the next step, that is the reading of the scriptures. Exegesis of the scriptures, actually, that's the technical term, exegesis. That means the consists as, you know, trying to squeeze from the text its meaning, right? You go and try to understand the text. That you are right there, doing exegesis. Okay. Now this is my question. Before we go, you know, I will not do what I've done, what I do normally, and have 10 principles how to read the scriptures. But I have one question which I always ask the students before we do that, before reading doing exegesis. What is, in your view, the best tool to read the scriptures? There is a trap in my question, I want to assure you. All right, so there is always a trap in my questions. My students know that. So let me just ask you that question, but just be honest and tell me what you think would be the best tool number one for doing exegesis. Yes? Holy Spirit. Wrong. You begin with something very shocking, right? Okay, I will shock you all the time. Okay, no, it's wrong. It's not the Holy Spirit. What is it? You have to know the Bible. You need to have a Bible. Wrong. That's not the first tool. What is it?
Brain.
What? I didn't get it. The brain? Wrong. That's not the first tool. Prayer? Wrong. It's not the first tool. Yes? What? The ears? Wrong also. All right, yes? Theology degree? Wrong also. All right, yes?
Desire to learn.
Desire to learn. Wrong. Right, okay, we can go on and yes?
We give up, you tell us.
Oh, yeah, right.
Eyes.
Eyes, wrong also. All right, what is it? Time. If you don't have time, you can get all what you said, it's not going to work. Okay, time is the first one. It's exactly what we don't have today. Therefore, we are not going to do exegesis because we don't have time. But we'll try to at least give some results of the process of exegesis, of the time which we took. And that's all we are going to do at this stage. So the exegesis of Genesis 1 and 2, that's our little assignment here, which I want to go into here. I've jotted a few notes here. And there are two things I want to do with you. First of all, get into Genesis 1 per se. And the whole chapter. I mean, when we say Genesis 1, generally we imply Genesis 1, verse 1, 2, chapter 2, verse 4a. That's the first account, what we call the creation account, okay? It ends at, at that particular moment of Genesis 2, verse 4, verse 4a, right? And so that's this whole thing. That will be and then we'll go into Genesis 1 and 2, because you cannot understand Genesis 1 if you don't read Genesis 2. That's another condition, So first, and in passing, by the way, I will touch a little bit the question which was raised before regarding the cultural element. There is a very important cultural element in the creation account. So you need to know that. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So in Genesis 1 particularly, and there are some good reasons for that. So in Genesis 1, that's the first thing, Genesis 1, then Genesis 1 and 2, and then I will take, if we have time, I will talk about Genesis 1, verse 1 to 2, right? The first two verses, well, let's say the beginning, because even the first word, I could say just on the word Bereshit, I could stay 2 days, and it will be short. All right, so only on the first word. Anyhow, so we'll just conclude on this matter. That's the program of this next few minutes. So first of all, then Genesis 1. When you read Genesis 1, at the end of the account, I know there are some discussion where is the end, but I believe the end is found in Genesis 2, verse 4a. Ele toldot hashamayim behibaram. When God, this is the generation, the genealogy of Shamayim, toldot hashamayim be'aretz, of the heavens and the earth, as they were created. So it kind of clearly points back to the whole text, and at the same time echo the very beginning. Because in the very beginning you had Bereshit, in beginning God created heaven and earth, and at the end you have this is the genealogy of the creation, the heaven and the earth as they were created. So it can, and there is even a chiastic structure, kind of a response, literary echo, between this last line here, which is indicating, which tells you these are the generation, pointing back, and the first verse of Genesis 1, Genesis 1:1. Okay, so it is a genealogy. This text is a genealogy, and not only we can say that because this is the indication which is provided to us right there at the end. So we have here a clue suggested, indicated by the author. What I just said, right, he said, is a genealogy. And indeed, when you study, you do a stylistic exegesis, a stylistic analysis of this text, literary analysis of this text, it is indeed, it has all the features, all the stylistic features of a genealogy, right? So it is recognized this as a genealogy. There, just to give you a few features here. First one, of course, when you look at the genealogy, it's regularity. The same thing. They generally come always with the same. Always a refrain. And it's always monotonous, it's not, don't have an action, it's an objective report, and you have kind of a refrain and a regularity. That's the first literary feature. Second would be, related to that dry character. No action there, right? No action really. It's a dry character. And then, then you have turning point. The function of a genealogy is marking a turning point. Whenever there is a turning point in a whole text, it's marked, it's indicated by a genealogy, and this is particularly true in the book of Genesis, which is articulated upon genealogy. We have 11 genealogies if I include this one, right? And there are some reasons why this creation story is entitled a genealogy and why it is also a genealogy. I'm going to talk about in a minute of that. Then, of course, also the importance, what characterizes this, the genealogy is that it is very important at that time, especially in the context of Israel, in the context of ancient times. To the genealogy is important. You are because of your father. When you are introduced to someone, you will have even that question in the Bible: whose son are you? Who is your father? Give me your genealogy. You don't have genealogy, you don't exist. So it's important. It's a way of establishing your historical identity. So that's the function, that's the purpose of a genealogy. It's not only it indicates a turning point, but also it has that particular purpose. That's why it's important and it is significant, meaningful, that the creation story is not only identified as a genealogy, but it is written in the style of a genealogy. Right? The creation story is not a revelation coming. We don't believe like the Muslims believe in the Quran. I'm just again touching some of the questions I heard before here. We don't believe that it came from heaven, right? The creation story did not come from heaven. Right? That's what the Muslim believe with the Quran. It came down from heaven. Or the Mormons are believing the same thing, it seems to me. Not so for the Bible. The prophet receives revelation. He understands things. God helps him understand, or her understand. And then he writes in his own language within his own culture. And he wrote in Hebrew, for instance. He didn't write in English. He didn't write in French. He wrote in Hebrew. It was his culture. All right. So you have then to understand his culture. You have to understand him, right? To be able to understand God. That's kind of an interesting phenomenon here, by the way, which clearly suggests you want to understand God, you better understand him down here. You cannot have access directly to God if you overlook the other who is testifying to God. So we are responsible in a way, put this in quotation mark, it has to do with the missionary work. We are responsible for God. Right? If Israel is not there to testify for God, God is not there too. So, right? So that's I'm saying that very quickly here. We could talk about that forever, but I mean that's an important element. The cultural element is present, and you have here, right, the language, the Toldot, and so forth. And there is something else. Right, there is also another important element here. Why is it that we begin the Bible with a genealogy? Why is it that the creation story is entitled a genealogy? It's because precisely the whole book of genealogy of Genesis is articulated upon genealogy, and you have the next genealogy is the genealogy of Adam, and then you have genealogy you have actually 5 genealogies, and then you have no genealogy, and then you have 5 genealogy, and this is the structure of the book of Genesis. I will come back to this tonight, but tell you that the genealogies are really marking the turning point, the progression of the book of Genesis, and Genesis 1 is a part of it. It's exactly like it connects. This story you have in Genesis 1 connects to the stories of the patriarchs and the story of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, and Joseph until the end. It has the same, in other words, and that's the reason that for this, that's the purpose for the journal, to tell you that what is written there has the same historical quality as all the as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You know, that's the point. You know, so you start the Bible with a genealogy, and then next genealogy is about, let's say, Noah, and then Abraham and Isaac. So it's a part of it. It's not separated. You see, this structure which separates Genesis 1:11 from the rest is biased, right? So way of saying, but this section is myth, and the other one is historical. You know, from Genesis 2 to Genesis 12, you have Abraham. This is the historical part. From Genesis 1 to 11, this is not the historical part. This is myth. That's not right, because from the point of view of the scriptures, actually, genealogy is a part of it, even the creation story. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second element, which tells you here, you have here an intention. You write that in the style of a genealogy. That's already something which is cultural. It comes from him. It provides you here already from the author an indication how to read the text. It's a historical document, and it's a part of the rest. Okay. Anyhow, but there are other reasons, but this is one of them. And the second cultural element, in a way, I had prepared that without having heard the presentation and without actually having heard the questions. I mean, this is a very important question, which was right, the connection with culture and the scriptures, and connection with culture with the creation. That's a very important question. Another, and that was, I think you alluded to that. You're right. I think it was the right response. It was that in that direction. You know, the polemic element of the creation story, and I've written on that, behind the steps of the Gerhard Hassel. And there are a number of elements which, when you read the creation story, you immediately recognize that the person who wrote the creation story has in mind the culture in which he is, whether it is the Egyptian culture. By the way, we don't realize how much Egyptianism we have in the book of Genesis, how many Egyptian words, Egyptian allusions in the book of Genesis. Even there are even plays on words when Moses speaks to Pharaoh, and he is making a kind of with a little irony. He's talking about the god Ra. You know, you heard the word the god Ra. Right, the Egyptian god, and he's playing on that, and the word Ra in Hebrew means evil, right? It doesn't mean evil in Egyptian, but he plays on that, right? Just to convey a message to Pharaoh at that time. There are many things. So there is the culture is there. The culture is there, and then you can see that from the very beginning, actually. But and then you don't have it. That's kind of interesting, and then you have spots. From the very beginning, you have an introduction. In the beginning, God created heavens and earth, and so forth. Then you have the description of the earth, which is tohu vavohu, chaos. And then God said. So you begin with a temporal clause, in the beginning, right? And then you have a description of the earth, the way it was. And then you have the first action. This introduction is found everywhere in ancient Near East. Right? It's found in Babylonian literature, it's found in Egyptian literature, it's all over. So Moses begins the same way. Well, there is a bit of a discussion there. That was my debate with Gerhard Hassel when I wrote my dissertation on the creation story. He wasn't following me on that matter, although at the end he kind of recognized that. It was not easy, but that's fine. It worked that way. So anyhow, what is happening here, because I read in a literary, that's my training. I'm a literary person before being a theologian. That was my first thing, reading the text and make sense of the literature there. So what is happening here is that the problem of conservatism, no, this is an influence, begins the same way as the others, therefore influence. In that case, it was not an influence, it was a polemic device. Because in literature, a polemic device, this is the way they function. And you have some cases even in the scriptures. Someone says something, and then there's another person who is going to respond and be polemic. what he's going to do, he begins the same way as the other has done. And then he says, he refutes him. Right? You have the case of an example of Job, which I found, let me see if I am lucky, and I found it right away. Okay? There's always a challenge that just crossed my mind here. I didn't prepare, but I think it's Genesis, Job, if I'm not mistaken. Let me see. Yes, 18 and 19. Right? This is the discussion between Job and Bildad. You remember the story of Job with his friends, and his friends were having a thesis, and Job did not agree, and his friends thought that Job was, had a certain theology which was going to be, which in their view was wrong. So Bildad, one of his friends, says, "How long till you put an end to words?" And then he gives all his thesis and all his ideas. And then Job answers, 19, "How long will you torment my soul and break me in pieces with words?" How long? Words. How long? Words. And he says something completely, he refutes him. So that's a polemic device here. So when he begins here, I'm just giving one example, there are many others, he begins the same way to say something different, right? So it's not because he says the same thing that he's influenced. No, he's just recognizing. He repeats with a smile. How long till the word? How long to the word? And then he says something contrary. Polemic device. And that's where, we had a little disagreement. It doesn't mean influence. It simply means, on the contrary, polemic. There are other, so you start the scriptures actually with a hint at the culture, right? That's the way Moses is. He's responding to the Egyptians, he's responding to the Babylonians. That's a part of his message, not just to us. The problem is we read the scriptures, we think it's only for us. Or perhaps for the one who is in the 19th century, as generous as we may be, but not before. Right? And certainly not in the time of Moses himself. Moses spoke also for the others, and including the pagans, right? So that's possible. Anyhow, so other elements, when you read the script, the Genesis 1, other elements you see which are polemic, which indicates culture. For instance, I've listed 5 here, right? 5. There are others, but the most important ones. The second one, when you see talking about the sun and the moon, right? The sun and the moon in Hebrew, right? This is Shemesh Yareach, right? That's the name. And when Moses elsewhere refers to the sun, he says Shemesh. The moon, Yareach. Not here. He says big lamp, small lamp. Why? That's very unusual, because the word Shemesh and Yareach, which are technical words for the sun and the moon, are at the same time names of gods. So no gods here. You see, there's just big lamps. Small lamp and instrument, tools. They are not gods. And the same idea is when we talk about the great fish. God created the great fish. He uses here a word, and he uses the word bara. God created. That's very, the word bara he doesn't use for the animals normally. He doesn't he uses it for bara, shamayim va'aretz, but only when you have man, when God created man in his image, bara, but fish, why fish, bara? Why, what kind of honor, is bara like, but to emphasize, because the fish, the big fish, the Leviathan, and it's the same kind of word, tanin here. The Leviathan in ancient Near East was a god. He was a living god. No one created it. Yes, it's a fish, and the word says it's like a small fry, just what it is. God created it. So kind of a polemic here, another one here, and then, well, of course, the whole idea of ex nihilo. When you look at the mentioned Near East, they are very rational people. They don't have revelation, so they try to infer the truth from their observation. Naturalist, observation. They see what happens in nature. They see, for instance, a scarab, the Kheper in ancient Egyptian. They see a scarab who is producing a bowl, out of themselves. It evolves, and then from the bowl there is another scarab which produces a bowl, and they call the word Kheper, they call the scarab evolution. The idea of evolution is already there. Right? You don't need to wait until, Darwin did not invent anything here. So what we have here, the point I'm making here is that in the ancient Near East, they could not believe a creation out of nothing. It was just, since God was before, was coming from God. So everything came from God, ex divino. Now the new thing for what we have here is God did not create out of himself. He created out of his word. So he created, for instance, humans. They were not taken, from his arm, or from his sperm, or from his saliva, as we have in ancient East. Right? Out of nothing. Yeah, so that's the new thing. That's also a refutation. And also, of course, when you talk about also the creation of humans, why did God create humans in Genesis 1? Very different from the intention of why did God create humans in ancient Egypt. The gods created humans for themselves, to have them serving them, to have them working on the toiling on the ground and bring them food. He created the man to become the servants of God for their own interest. In the creation story, God created man to serve them. God gives the food to men. Whereas in the ancient East, the men are giving the food to God. Very different. You can see immediately, the different picture, and you can see that really the polemic element here, how he refutes at the same time, and at the same time we receive a certain message, right? At the same time, it's still relevant for us. So we can even identify with this ancient culture and be able to enjoy and receive the message which was intended for them and also for us. Now, this is what I wanted to say about Genesis 1. Let me just say a few words about Genesis 1 and 2. As I said, you cannot understand Genesis 1 if you don't read Genesis 2. That's the problem. Well, the problem, the first problem, okay, we'll come to that in a moment. When you read Genesis 1 and 2, you together, you are confused because it's so different, right? So when the biblical scholars started reading Genesis 1 and 2, they were also confused, and so they tried to find a reason for that. I just want to give you an idea of the observation which I have, which was the object of my dissertation quite a couple of centuries ago. So, and it's still present in my mind. I'm trying to refresh that, and in a way I brought it in my book of Genesis here. And when you read the text here, you can see that there is really, let me say it right away, the Genesis 1 is written in connection to Genesis 2, and Genesis 2 is written in connection to Genesis 1. There is a parallel, there is a parallelism. We were talking about, I heard that there is no poetry. Yeah, to a certain extent, it's not poetry in the sense we understand, but there is poetry. Actually, in Semitic language, in Semitic cultures, everything is poetry. When they speak to you in the market, you buy a tomato, they respond in poetry. It's a part of the thing. So it doesn't mean that we are not eating the tomato. It's a real tomato. But they say it's a beautiful tomato. You are in that particular context. So you are not in the context where you have poetry, therefore it's outside of life. Poetry is a part of life, right? That's the way they are. Right? So when you read Genesis 1 and 2, and read a biblical text or any text in the ancient times, you read even the Quran. This is what the Muslims say. What language are we reading the Quran? Oh, in English. You don't understand because it doesn't. You don't ring. You don't hear it doesn't have to read to listen to the sounds, the poetic element. Otherwise, you don't understand. All right. So when you read the text, this is what you have for. we have first this introduction. When I began with that introduction, and I said, well, there is a hint at the same introduction elsewhere, but there is also a hint at the second creation account. The same structure, the same construction, syntax of that introduction is reproduced in the introduction of the second creation account. That means Genesis 2. To begin with also a temporal clause, in the day, in the beginning, in the day, when, as the earth was not yet, it was not. That's the corresponds to the as the earth was tohu vavohu, void and so forth. Then God did something. In Genesis 1, we had God said. In Genesis 2, we have at the same moment, not God said, but God, and then new verbs, right? So you have a structure of 7 sections. The seventh one in Genesis 1 is, what is it? Yeah, the Sabbath, right. You know what the 7th section is in the second creation account? The couple, the marriage. These two institutions are put together in parallel, right? So we make sometimes we are talking about 2 institutions. We are doing some theology. We connect the Sabbath and the marriage. It is biblically, founded, and this is why you have in some texts, Sabbath associated with family, right? So anyhow, so you have a rhythm, the same rhythm, right? This with 7 days and 7 parts, 7 works of God. So there are parallels. So I want to enter into all the details. There we'll stay until tonight. Okay, so what's the purpose of this parallel? What are the lessons we are learning from this parallel? This is something which is, by the way, when the problem is that I cannot convince you because I'm not presenting you the parallels, but this is very convincing. And this has been recognized, this has been acknowledged by a number of scholars. You read any commentary today, I must say with, kind of humility, you forgive me, that they will recognize that contribution. You read the book by, Rethinking Genesis. I forgot the name of the author. Anyhow, it's important, not important. And you read Matthews, the commentary of, he recognized also that fact, literary fact, that these are parallels. So, first consequence, first lesson, unity of the text. You don't have contradiction. It's simply the same author. You cannot ignore that now anymore. Then the documentary, those people who are still working with the documentary hypothesis, even if they still believe in the documentary hypothesis, they do not found their thesis on the observation that we have here, 2 creation stories. It started, by the way, the documentary hypothesis and this whole matter, this whole discussion, it started with the observation. It was a French medical doctor who, he perhaps didn't have enough patience, so he had time to deal with the Bible. And so Astruc, that's his name, so he found these 2 chapters. It says this is opposite, this is not the same God, this is not the same theology. So 2 sources, 2 authors. What we say, 2 authors at that time, right? Now we don't do that anymore. That was the basis, that was the starting point of the documentary hypothesis. They ignore that anymore because this argument, which was the beginning of this whole thing, doesn't hold anymore. Right? So, but they will find other, even if you destroy the second one, they will find a third one, and whatever. That's the way it works with these people, because as it has been said, the philosophy is behind. The problem is the philosophy. It's not the evidence. I heard that today the last time. It was great. It's the philosophy. It's not the evidence. All right. So, first lesson then, the unity of those 2 texts. They belong together. The second, I would say, and then at the same time, the unity, but also it provides you with with a hint how to read the scriptures, by the way. Tension. It means you have two opposite perspectives. You have, on one hand, you have God, Elohim, the great God, the word Allah. No, God above everyone. It has the idea of strength, of power, of transcendence. Elohim. And the plural emphasizes even. You have the word Allah itself, Elah, which is attested in ancient Canaanite language and so forth, and in ancient cultures, to refer to really the great God. That's the word Allah, which become Allah in Semitic languages. That refers to the great God. And then he adds a plural, which is nothing to do with Trinity. Trinity is going to be indicated in another way, but the plural there is what we call a plural of majesty, a plural which indicates it's so great that it's like a plural. Intensity, majesty, Elohim. That's the perspective we have when and God is, and man is just a little dot in this whole thing. It's like nothing, at the end. It's a little dot in the universe. That's the perspective. And the second perspective is suddenly to Elohim you have another name which is added systematically, and that's the name Yahweh, which comes from a root which means hava, which means exist, the one who is. Actually, it's related to the verb ehyeh, when Moses asked God, "What? Give me your name," because he wanted to control him. Coming from an Egyptian background, he said, "Aha, you want my name? I will be who I will be." Right? Kind of irony, because God does irony once in a while. You see, so Yahweh, he is the one who will be, the one who is, who is close, who is near, who speaks to you, who walks with you, who loves you, who has a relationship, personal relationship. And you see God there in Genesis 1 suddenly. He's not just saying, oh, he created man in his image and that's it. But now he's presents you God close to man, even giving him a kiss, closing physically and so. And then in the second account, the whole text is about relationship between God and man. Right? See, the two different perspectives. And it seems contradictory. If you don't understand the principle of tension, you will not understand the Bible. It starts with that. It's true here, it's also true there. The problem is we say it's true here, therefore it's not true there. Well, that's not the way it functions in biblical thinking. Very often you have, we'll call to that, I could, until what, just remind me until, okay, 5 minutes to, all right, good. I told you, time element. Okay, so the Egyptian lesson, the exegetical lessons we can learn after this. The next thing is the fact that we have, this creation has been, when you look at the tohu vavohu, the void, and on the other side you have not yet. That tells you already, that gives you the key to the tohu vavohu, that it has been created while the earth was not yet, contaminated, right? Not yet sin. And we can add, there are other elements which again emphasize these things. Okay, so, right, theological lessons. Theological lessons from there is the fact that when you realize that God is the transcendent, He's far, but He's also close. And the problem we have is to deal with that. Either God is too close or God is too far. And this is something we have in cultures. There are some cultures who only believe in God far. And other cultures who are only believe, think of God only close. Either He is Allah or He's the little Jesus who is, I can put in the pocket. Right? We have not been able to realize, to bring the two together. Right? So either we emphasize the transcendence of God and no close, or we emphasize the nearness of God and He's no longer. It's interesting that when we look at the prayers in the Bible, very often Psalm 23, Daniel, the many prayers, when he begins the prayer, it's in the third person. He, God, He. That's the first thing he starts. He, the great God. He, the one, the other one. The in German, the other one. And he begins with that, he, once he's gone through that experience of God being the he, the third person, then after this first step, then thou. You don't get to God thou directly. You have to, first of all, experience God as a he. And the he without the thou doesn't work, and the thou without the he doesn't work. The tension, you see, it tells us here, it gives us here a lesson, which, by the way, will be an important lesson for worship. Because you have a worship, we have a problem with worship. You realize that? In churches, you have churches, God is only far. And people are worshiping frozen fish. They don't move. As soon as the toe is moving, suspect. Right? And then you have the other one, they're jumping down and running. They have not been able to bring the two together. That's the challenge. That's the Bible. Right? See the lesson you can learn from the very beginning. And I will talk about creation and worship tonight in connection to the creation in the Old Testament. You will see that will be one of the things. Oh, now, right, I have 27 seconds to say something about 2 minutes, right, yes, 2 minutes to speak about 2 verses. Well, I would need at least 5 hours to speak about just this first word of Bereshit. Let me just say a word about that. When you begin reading Genesis 1 and 2, in the beginning God created heavens and earth, the earth, as far as the earth is concerned. You immediately, I'm just beginning with things you know, all right? That's the way it appears to you when you read in English. In the beginning God created heaven and earth, the earth. We begin the earth. The next word is the earth, right? How is it in English? I forgot. All right, quickly. Okay, so you have here, in the beginning God created the heavens and earth. Yes, the earth was without. So he starts as the next verse, right after having said, in the beginning God created the heavens and earth, as far as the earth is concerned. So you begin reading the scriptures to give you, that's all we can do. We are not doing this, we can just give the result. Something, it's a whole process of years of work and debate and so forth. Basically, in a quick way, when you begin reading these 2 verses, this is the way how we should read it. We should read it as I wrote it down somewhere in my Bible. We should read it that way. Actually, it tells you when we talk about heaven and earth. I believe that heaven and earth has, from the very beginning, a way of indicating that God created everything. Right? It's the whole universe. As far as the earth is concerned, now it's focusing. And what is interesting, what the first message you hear when you read it in Hebrew, is that the focus on the earth, the creation of the earth, is put against the background of the creation of the universe. Tells you that the God who created you, the earth, is the same God who created the whole universe. In other words, he the creation of heavens and earth is in the background of the creation of the earth. And this is already the first lesson you receive is a lesson of humility and at the same time of awe. That we are a part of a greater project. We are a part, God created earth from the perspective of already this great creation. This is so, when I discovered that, I was so crushed. We are not just, in passing, just this. He did that with the blueprint of the whole universe. That's what we are. Right? So that's something you can. And by the way, when you read, I'm just giving you something, a quick observation from the point of view of the syntax and the style and so forth, literary study, literal analysis. But if you just take the first word, Bereshit, which by the way, you notice that you begin the Bible with boom. An explosion, it's a sound, and I will come back tonight, with the Bereshit bara, Bereshit bara. You can read twice. He says bara twice. Just starts. And this word Bereshit you begin with the first word, full of controversy. full of debate. Actually, the scholars are divided, equal. Bereshit is absolute. That means in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. That's what you have in your translation. Or is it construct? Bereshit, in the beginning of the creation, then God said. Division. There are many arguments for both. I don't have time to get there. If you are happy, if I have time, I would have. But they are equal value. You cannot decide. You decide on the basis of your philosophical presupposition, but not on the basis of grammar. On the basis of grammar, you stay like this, and you can't decide. Actually, the best decision would be tension. That's where we are. Both. Right? Bereshit means it's an absolute. That means then God created, in the beginning, God created everything. And Bereshit is a construct. In the beginning of the creation of heavens and earth, then suddenly heaven and earth has another meaning. God said. You see. And you have to take, perhaps, I'm just suggesting that, maybe the only way to solve that tension is to take the two of them together. And then what will happen, the lesson we are learning, and we will conclude on that. I see the 0 here. So this is very simple. This is exactly the lesson which I'm. The God who created the whole universe is the very God who created the earth. All right. It's a wonderful lesson, very majestic lesson, a lesson of humility and of recognition. All right, this is Genesis 1. Yes.
What a pity not to be able to hear more at this time. Love to hear more. Thank you, Jacques. That was inspiring and stimulating, at least. We have another treat, however. Dr. Chadwick, Art Chadwick, has a talk which we're also very interested in, and I won't take time from his talk. Let's get started, Art. It's going to be a very interesting topic.
Thank you, Jim. Everyone should have the honor of following Dr. Dukan in his talk. What an amazing thing. All right, so we have to talk about the origin of man. That's very seminal to everything we're doing. It's also a very challenging and difficult subject. So we'll go through this together. The questions that we are confronted with in our lives, the life questions are, where did we come from? Why are we here and where are we going? And the Bible gives us the answer to those questions. And our intent then is to ferret out that if we came from the hand of God, how can we explain the hominid fossils? How can we explain the evidence, the scientific evidence of origin of man? So that's what we're going to do today, and I'm going to posit 3 possibilities, and then we will discuss them. First one, they are intermediates between ape-like ancestor and modern humans. In other words, the evolutionary scenario, the standard evolutionary model. I would counter this proposal with this data. Man did not originate by evolution. We know this because we know enough about molecular biology to know that the development of a single protein from de novo in all of geologic time is an impossibility. In the human, there are several genes that are responsible for the human brain being larger than that of the ape, and we'll get to this in a minute. The possibility of getting even one meaningful protein to form by random processes in all of geologic time is inconceivably small. We've already touched on that subject, even if we had a mechanism for forming proteins. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's just quickly go through what a protein is. A protein is a very discrete molecule. It has structures called peptide bonds in it. These bonds determine between each amino acid in the protein, they determine the directionality. So does the next residue go this way or does it go this way? And because the peptide bond is a very unique bond, it has a lot of the properties of a double bond, that prevents the free motion around that join. So that means that proteins are constrained by the primary structure to form a certain tertiary structure. So if we look at this in more detail, you can see here a primary structure of a series of amino acids. In the information contained in those amino acids is the information to form secondary structures within that primary structure, and finally a tertiary structure, as you see down here, of a protein molecule. And finally, that tertiary structure invariably has to interact with other proteins to form some kind of quaternary structure. All of that information on how to do that is contained in the primary structure of the protein. If you know enough, if you're smart enough, you can predict from the outcome of a primary structure what the tertiary structure will look like. If you're smart enough, even for a simple protein, let's say 100 amino acids long, you get something very complex coming out of it. Here is a molecule of hemoglobin. We also heard about this morning. It consists of 4 subunits, each of which has 141 or 146 amino acids. Those 2 molecules, those 4 molecules fit together in a perfect synchrony that makes that molecule able to absorb and release oxygen and thus oxygenate our tissues. As I said, if we knew enough, we could predict the structure of the three-dimensional structure of a protein from its amino acid sequence. So IBM set out to do this in 1999. They started a project called the Blue Gene Project. Blue because IBM's called Big Blue, and gene because it's dealing with genes. They thought if they built a big enough computer, they could predict the outcome of a 100 amino acid long strand of DNA, of amino acids, to tell what that protein would look like. And if they did that, they would control the world, because if you could predict the outcome of a series of amino acids, then you can make proteins that have specific shapes, and so the theory goes then you could make designer proteins. So they built the protein, the computer, called a Blue Gene. They used Pentium computer chips. They put 2 of them on a card, and they put 2 of those cards together, and then they had a set of cards, and then they built these towers with those sets of cards, and they constructed this computer. After the computer was constructed, they dedicated the entire output. It's all in parallel. This is massively parallel. There were 600,000 computers in these boxes. They dedicated the entire output of that computer to trying to resolve the 3-dimensional structure of the primary sequence of amino acids in a 100 amino acid long protein. At the conclusion of the year, they realized they were not going to be able to predict the outcome of a amino acid sequence to tell them what that protein would look like when it's done. The most powerful computer in the universe, or in the world, we don't know what's out there, dedicated for an entire year in massively parallel processing to solving a simple problem, just one little sequence of amino acids. Tell me what it's going to look like when it's all folded up. So they started working on bigger computers. They used 16-chip modules, and they put those together on these cards, and they put it all together in these stacks arrays. It was called Sequoia. Here you can see this is all one computer, 8 cabinets long, and I think it's 12 cabinets. There are a total of 96 cabinets, and each of those had 100,000 processors, and I think the total was 1,600,000 processors. So they built the computer. It did 20 petaflops, but they never went back to the protein problem. They didn't see it as soluble. Instead, the NSA started buying up their computers, and they started making money off of the Blue Gene Project. The world's most powerful computer working for an entire year was not capable of predicting the shape of a single protein molecule from its primary structure. Yet, otherwise intelligent beings believe that functional proteins involved in producing the human brain, such as those produced by the orphan human brain specific Notch genes, the GTP activated genes, that one, and HIDIN2, that these arose by some cosmic accident without a designer that are necessary for the formation of our brain. Well, while we're on this subject of the human brain, the same Sequoia supercomputer with a 1.6 million processors, all running in parallel, was thought to be able to cover about 1% of the human brain's activity. Do you hear that? The most powerful computer, it fills up that gigantic room, was thought to be able to do about 1% of the activities of the human brain. But more recent studies have revealed that the human brain is made up of 86 billion processors. 86 billion processors. How many are in the IBM? 1.6 million. So it's like 86 billion computers operating in parallel, or 60,000 Sequoia computers running in parallel. But that's not all. Studies that just came out this year, this is an amazing paper, having to do with the amacrine cell in the insect eye. This is what they said about it. The single cell acts as hundreds of parallel functioning units. This is one neuron. Acts like 1,400 parallel computers. Here is a view of it. Here is the area right here where that amacrine cell is situated. Here's the fly eyes. This is the fly brain. This is the optic chiasma there. And here is the optic lobe in the eye of the fly. Here is the amacrine cell, single neuron. This just shows one part of it. This is the part that attaches to 11 different sites. But look, this neuron is situated so that it connects with all these different neurons coming from the eye. 1,400 different connections of just that one neuron. So if a single human neuron can carry out the function over 1,400 individual computers, and we just now found this out, how much more complexity is there yet to discover? And the answer is a lot more. And just a side note, they recently expressed hopes to generate a human-capable artificial intelligence machine are pipe dreams. The idea that we could substitute something that has, let's say, 1 million processors for a human brain that has 86 billion is absurd. But the question arises, how could such a complex system exist without a designer? So back to our starting question. If man cannot have evolved, what sense can we make out of the human fossil record? Number 2, we can divide up the fossils and throw them into one of 2 bins. This is what scientists do. Scientists put things into bins. So they like to be able to do this. So we put some as ape-like men, and some as human-like apes. Some are human-like apes, some are degenerate humans. So there are no intermediates, no problem. Right? That solves the problem. Except, where do we draw the line? There? 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 Before we can answer this question, we're going to have to learn something about the fossil record. So let's do that now. The Hominoidea is the superfamily that contains apes and man. Within it are three families: the Hylobatidae, this is the gibbons; the Pongidae, these are the great apes; and the Hominidae. That's us. Three different families. Hylobatidae are brachiators, that is, they swing from their arms. They're very unique kinds of animals. The Pongidae are knuckle walkers. They walk not on their hands flat, but on their knuckles like this. They develop calluses on those knuckles so that they can use them as feet, but they walk on all fours. And the Hominidae, which are supposed to be standing up, but my colleague chose this picture of me in a dinosaur quarry with my hands on the ground as a joke on me. So. But you know, they stand up, okay. Today, there are no modern intermediates between the families. So we don't find something between the Hylobatidae and the Pongidae. We don't find something between Pongids and Hominidae. There are no intermediates. However, in the fossil record, there are bipedal organisms, that means they walked on 2 feet, that are intermediate between the Pongids and anatomically modern man, and that's what we're going to focus on now. There are 6 main groups of these: the Australopithecines, represented here by Australopithecus afarensis, that would be Lucy. There are Homo habilines. There are Homo erectines, and here you can see a Homo erectus. There are archaic Homo sapiens, and there's a cluster of different forms that fall into that category. There are Neanderthals, and there are anatomically modern men. Well, how do we know for sure that these fossil forms were walking upright? How do we know that an organism walks on all fours or walks upright? You can tell by looking at the anatomy of the hip area. There are several features that give this away. Number one, the socket of the femur doesn't allow the animal to walk like we walk. That is, it would walk with its legs going back, but not forward. And the support given to the gut, you have a extension of the femur, extension of the hip up into the gut area so it can support the gut, because the gut is like this and it would need some kind of support. And here you can see the angle of insertion of the femur. So if you watch a bonobo walk, it looks very strange because it doesn't have the range of motion that we do with our legs. So it can only walk like this, and it can't walk like this.
So,
if we look at the pelvis of hominids, this is a chimpanzee pelvis here. You can see the high iliac crest designed to support the gut. And this is a Australopithecine, which is intermediate in form between the chimpanzee and modern human over here. And this is a Homo erectine, which is fairly highly reconstructed. And so you can see that there are intermediate shapes representing those forms from left to right. If you look at the skulls, these are the ones that I consider to be apes, Pithecanthropus, and this is Australopithecus skull. This is a Homo habiline skull. This is a Homo erectine skull. This is a Neanderthal skull, and this is a modern human skull. Where would you draw the line? Here's another series, starting with the chimpanzee, Australopithecus, Afarensis, Homo habilis here, Homo rudolfensis, looks like, Homo ergaster, Homo heidelbergensis. These would be the ancient homos. And then Homo sapiens, this is Cro-Magnon, and this is modern man here. Where would you draw the line if you were basing it on the skulls? If you look at the brain capacity, you see the Australopithecines over here have a very small cranial capacity, about 400 to 500 cubic centimeters. And then we get into the erectines. They overlap with the Australopithecines. And then we get into, well, these are Homo habilis here and Homo erectines. And then we get into the ancient man, and then we have modern man here. And the Neanderthals, some of their cranial capacity is even greater than that of modern man. When we do principal component analysis on the skull shape, this is 150 measurements made inside the skulls, we can see that there is a clear differentiation between modern man over here, Neanderthals up here, and Homo erectines over here. So you cannot use the skull to say, well, these belong in this box and these belong in this box. Most people would put Neanderthals in with modern humans, but they don't belong there by PCA. If we look at the skulls, the base of the skulls, we can see that the foramen magnum is differentially displaced in these skulls. Because the chimpanzee, it's way at the back of the skull because the head is held erect like this. In Australopithecus, it's farther forward, but still near the back. In Homo erectus, it's near the center, but still toward the back. And in modern Homo sapiens, it's in the center. Where would you draw the line? If you look at the jaw, this is the jaw of a chimpanzee. This is a modern man. You can see the teeth rows are very distinct. In chimpanzees, they're straight lines. In modern man, there's a perfect parabolic arch. In the fossil forms, in the fossil Australopithecines, it's a straight line, two straight parallel lines. In Homo erectus, it's still a straight line. And even in Neanderthal, even though it's coming around toward a modern skull, a modern jaw, it still has straight lines on both sides. There are three characteristics that distinguish chimpanzees from humans that are universally recognized. One is the straight tooth row, you can see here. The second is the lack of a mental eminence. Now, the mental eminence, if you put your finger on the middle of your jaw, lower jaw, you should feel a little bump there. If you don't say anything now. Come see me after. But that is very important because no fossil skull, other than modern man, has that bump. Chimpanzees don't have it. Australopithecines don't have it. Homo habilis don't have it. Homo erectines don't have it. Neanderthals don't have it. And that's a characteristic unique to humans. The other thing that you can see here, as I said, is the straight teeth rows and the characteristics of the teeth themselves. So virtually all of these forms differ from modern man that are not modern skulls. Well, what about some of the new forms we found? Homo florensis, Homo floresiensis. This is the cave in the island of Flores where these remains were found. They found quite a few bones, more than we usually find with these fossil forms. Here is the skull compared with a modern human skull. You can see that it's considerably smaller. The cranial capacity is the same as Australopithecus. There is no mental eminence on the chin. The skull has been compared with some other things. People have tried to figure out what this being is. The problem with Homo floresiensis is it's way too modern because it's dated at about 15,000 years. All these other forms like Homo habilis and Homo erectus, they're dealing with hundreds of thousands of years. Here we're dealing with something a few thousand years ago. And here's a modern skull for comparison. Here's Homo floresiensis. Here's a Homo sapiens that has suffered from head binding when they were little. It looks a little like it, but it does have a chin.
So,
What about the Denisovans? This is a cave over in Russia. It's actually in forgotten where it is. Can't remember. Anyway, these are all the remains they found from there, even though you see them in the headlines all the time. And they show this creature with all these characteristics, but it's based on 3 teeth, a joint from the finger, a piece of a jaw, and 1 set of bones. So sometimes people always accuse us who work with dinosaurs of making up dinosaurs by taking 1 bone and then reconstructing the rest of it. Well, these guys are really doing that. Here is Homo floresiensis in the middle, compared with Homo habilis over here and Homo erectus over here. And you can see they're very, very similar. Characteristics of the skull are very similar. Then very recently, over in Africa again, they found the remains. Lee Berger is the one that did this. He's a very well-known and quasi-respected paleoanthropologist. He's quasi-respected because every time he finds one, he thinks it's the missing link. And so he gets into a lot of trouble with his colleagues. So he found these remains of Naledi, Homo naledi, and they were found in a very unusual setting. This is a cave. Here's the surface. To get there, they had to crawl through a 10-inch high crevice, and then they had to climb over the top of this thing and then squeeze down through this chute to get into this chamber. It was found by some cavers. Obviously, no paleoanthropologist would be in there looking back there, because in the first place, how do you get the remains there? You know, when somebody dies, you might dig a hole in the ground and bury them, but would you haul them through a 10-inch high crevice in the dark, unless you're carrying a torch along, which is pretty difficult, then climb over the top of this and drop it down in here? I actually have a picture of that cave. Here's what it looks like. You can see there are human remains all over the place. So they have a lot of stuff to work with. They didn't have a skull for the first creature they found, but now they have a skull, called it Neo. They found it in a slightly different place. And again, it doesn't look like a modern human skull. It looks like something that's very different from what we have today. Here's a comparison of some of these skulls. Here's Homo naledi over here. That would be Neo. Here's Homo floresiensis, Homo erectus, and Homo habilis. You can see none of those looks very much like a modern human skull. If we look at the jaw, lower jaw, you can see here in Australopithecus, we have those straight tooth rows. Here's a modern human, and here is Homo naledi. Notice it has those straight tooth rows, parallel tooth rows, just like the Australopithecines. Then when I was on my way here, I found this one that just was published recently. I don't have the date on it, but it's within the last month. A new species from the late Pleistocene in the Philippines. It's going to figure in the discussion about fossil man, but we don't know where yet. This is what they found so far, some finger bones, some teeth, and a couple of long bones, so it sounds very much like a Denisovan. So when we put these all together, we find these kinds of diagrams about the range of fossil man. So what you do is you arrange the skulls by radiometric dating, or whatever method of inference you have for the date. And then you line them up, and then you try to figure out which ones go together. And notice all the dotted lines. Notice that all the dotted lines are connecting straight lines. The straight lines represent where the fossil remains are the same through that range. So you have a straight line, no change, and then you have a dotted line and question marks. They should have put a lot more question marks in there than they did. But this is the way people try to reconstruct these fossil men. Here's another diagram just to show you that one's not unique. Again, here are the remains, the actual fossil remains over this period, and then question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. And no wonder Lee Berger is working so hard to find a real intermediate, because nobody has a clue what to do with this. Here's a couple of quotations. Even with all the fossil evidence and analytical techniques from the past 50 years, a convincing hypothesis for the origin of Homo remains elusive. Does that tell you something? Even allowing for the poor record we have of our close extinct kin, Homo sapiens appears as distinctive and unprecedented. There is certainly no evidence to support the notion that we gradually became who we inherently are over an extended period in either the physical or intellectual sense. So basically, you can do what you want with the data at this point. So there is no natural place to divide hominids. So back to our starting question, if man can't have evolved, we looked at the evidence for that. If we can't divide him into by any sensible criteria into degenerate humans and extinct apes, we still have to try to make sense out of this record, because the record has data in it, and these data tell us there is a distribution of human characteristics through time. So let me try a third proposal here, a radical proposal. There are intermediates between an ape and modern humans that resulted from mixing of genetic material. Now that's an uncomfortable situation. What if instead of representing a successive hierarchy of evolution, something we falsified, what we see in the fossil record represents a series of intermediates resulting from the combining of genetic material from human and apes after the flood. Intermediates are the result of back-crossing to both end members, producing what is referred to as reticulate pattern of evolution. So if you cross this with this, you get this. This can cross with this can cross with this, and fill in the intermediate ones. All this, while this is going on, descendants of Shem are somewhere else on the earth, just to give you a time frame. But is it even possible? Can genetic material from apes and humans be combined? Well, in a sense, we're doing that today. And this is a scary proposal, by the way. Not something I take lightly. Sheep-human hybrids made in the lab. Human-pig hybrid created in the lab. These are not National Enquirer. These are National Geographic. Here's one from Nature, talks about, you can't really see it, but it's a combining, trying to make a human embryo without using the human source, and combining together genes from different organisms. So yes, this is going on today. We are combining human genes and genes from other organisms, pigs, sheep, and what have you. And it's been going on for quite a while. But can, for example, a human sperm combine with a chimpanzee egg to produce a viable offspring? This is one of the mechanisms that God has instituted to protect the genes, to protect the integrity of organisms, is the lack of ability of a sperm to penetrate an egg of a foreign species. This is not true for hominids, for whatever reason. It turns out that human sperm can attach to the fertilization membrane of Hominoidea. The experiments were done back in 1977 by Michael Bedford, a very famous scientist, and he showed that the human sperm would attach to a gibbon egg. However, he tried it with all the other monkeys. It wasn't monkeys, it was the Hominoidea that allowed this to take place. Only in that group, the gibbons, the chimpanzees, and humans. Attempts were made in Germany under Hitler to combine humans and chimpanzee genes, but to fertilize, cross-fertilize them. His goal was to make a mass of Jews crossed with chimpanzees that would do all the work and all the fighting for him. That was his goal. I mean, he was nuts. What can I say? And in Russia, under Ilyanova, this guy tried everything he could to make a cross between a chimpanzee and a human. He failed in every case, not because the experiments failed, but because I think God intervened to prevent him from doing the experiments. He would set up a series of females, chimpanzees, impregnate them with human sperm, and they would die before the experiment was finished. He organized a series of women in southern Africa somewhere, who he got to volunteer to receive a sperm from a chimpanzee. And he couldn't find a chimpanzee to do the fertilization. All he had was young chimps. They weren't mature and he couldn't use them. So his experiment was foiled. And if you read the story, and by the way, it's an interesting story to read, you'll see that something got in the way of every single thing that he tried. And he dedicated his whole life to getting this hybrid to occur. There are a number of cases listed here in the Wikipedia article under Humanzee. Humanzee is a word that was coined by Gordon Gallup, I believe, who was a scientist. I don't want you to read this. You can read it on your own if you want, but here's a number of cases where human chimpanzee crosses were successful. And in 1997, Dr. Spencer and I were looking on the internet to see if there was any indication anywhere of a cross between, or this kind of experiment going on. And we found a site at University of Pennsylvania in the paleoanthropology department, which described the very experiment we're talking about, the impregnation of a female chimpanzee with human sperm, and that it had been successful. Before we could capture the website, it disappeared, and we were never able to do that. But very shortly thereafter, there was on a paleoanthropological blog that we were following, there was the following discussion that I'll share with you. One correspondent said, "As I understand it, labs have artificially inseminated a female chimp on 2 separate occasions. In both cases, shortly after the mother reached her first trimester, both pregnancies were aborted." In the ensuing discussion, and remember this is among professional paleoanthropologists, this is PalAnt is the name of the net. The discussion that went on was a discussion not of whether this experiment had been done, they all seemed to know that, but about the moral implications and the problems they would have if they ever brought this to fruition. I think it may have been the same day, but shortly after she posted that, this one was posted by another correspondent. He says, "Shh, the creationists will get hold of this and use it to say that all non-modern hominids were chimp-human crosses at different degrees of human genetic input. Satan's work and all that." Egad. Do you see the point? These people recognize that this is a viable explanation for what we see in the fossil record. And the question is, well, we're not the only ones that see the implications of this. In the magazine Nautilus, a scientist with a strong antagonism to creationists proposed that such a cross ought to be vigorously pursued in order to shut up the creationists once and for all. They felt like if they produced a hybrid between chimpanzee and human, that would shut the creationists up. He didn't realize what the other guy had said. And here's the headline: it's time to make a human-chimp hybrid. You know what it's time for? It's time for Jesus to come back. Scientifically possible. Not only did he propose that, but Richard Dawkins was also asked that question. What would you think about making a human-chimp hybrid? He thought it would be a great idea. It would resolve all these questions. The question is, can you cross these various forms? Can you cross humans with chimpanzees? Can you cross chimpanzees with Australopithecines? Can you cross them with Homo erectings? The answer is yes. And in fact, scientists have demonstrated that humans crossed with Neanderthals. They have proposed that humans crossed with all the other genera, Homo genera. This is interbreeding between humans and Homo sapiens. That's the ancient humans. Humans crossed with Homo erectings. And they crossed with erectings and habilines. And they crossed with chimpanzees. And the evidence is based on some things that they have seen in these fossils. Notice this is not the National Enquirer. This is New Scientist. And they said there's plenty of evidence to suggest that chimps and humans recrossed after humans had already evolved, and that these back crosses were done, and we can see that in the modern environment. You know, this is sobering stuff. Matthew 17:26, as it was in the days of Noah, so also will it be in the days of the Son of Man. Genesis 11:6, nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. That's at the Tower of Babel when God said, we've got to get these people out of this city. Ellen White says, if there was one sin above another, which called for the destruction of the race by the flood, it was a base crime of amalgamation of man and beast, which defaced the image of God and caused confusion everywhere. God purposed to destroy by a flood that powerful, long-lived race that had corrupted their ways before him. If there was one sin above another, this is after she describes rape, pillage, murder, all the other possible sins you could imagine. We have a strong explanation for the data from paleoanthropology, consistent with the Bible and the spirit of prophecy. Now, we can't really know if this explanation is correct, can we? Fortunately. Because if we could say, yes, that cross can be done, we'd be looking at the combination of human genes with animal genes again, something that we're told brought the destruction of the world in the flood. But it's realistic and consistent with what we know scientifically, and it adequately explains the data. We can be sure that if the proposal is verified, God will respond. Then I wanted to say one more thing about this data while we're on the subject, because sometimes these quotes have been misused to suggest that one group or another represents some of these hominids. And it is clear today that we are all one family. There is nobody that is a human being today that is not related to me by blood. And I think, well, this was given to me in Africa when I was recently there on a visit. It's called Racism for Dummies. I particularly like it because that egg's a lot prettier than that one, if you think about it. And my granddaughter raises chickens, and we're always trying to get these kinds of eggs because they're so beautiful. So, yes, that's where we are. And I think the exclamation that you saw a minute ago by the paleoanthropologist that was afraid that creationists would get a hold of this information, we have got a hold of it. And when we get a hold of it, we do have answers to explain the intermediate forms. Of course, there are lots of unanswered questions. And that's a good thing, because as scientists, if we had all the answers, we'd be done. We're not, we'd have nothing else to do. One of the questions we don't have an answer for is this one. Where are all the giant men? Thank you.
Well, thank you for providing such a clear explanation that I'm sure there are no questions. But we do have time, just in case someone has a question, we do have time to consider some. And we have a hand, oh, there we go.
Thank you for your talk. Just one question. So you would regard these fossilized bones as pre-flood?
I think all the forms we have found so far are post-flood. We don't know of any cases of any human fossils that have been found that are pre-flood so far. I mean, that's a almost compelling absence that must be meaningful. But yes, that's the case.
Given the number of the paucity of fossils, there must have been quite a huge population of these potential hybrids in order for you to actually find them. And clearly there seem to be a number that have been found. So that being the case, which suggests that genetic mix has been fairly widespread, how can you be confident, and I think it's a very interesting hypothesis, but how can you be confident to make the comment then that no humans actually don't have that genetic material?
Now that's a really good question, and it's been asserted that there are still Neanderthals wandering around Europe. So I'm not sure who they would point at, but Neanderthals do not have a chin. And people in Europe that you would ascribe to Neanderthal characteristics, they have a chin. So in that respect, they are not the bearers of this hybridization as far as we can tell.
Very quickly, Neanderthals have been associated with burying their dead and a lot of associated
Yeah.
that are very humanistic. So the thought of being Neanderthals and a number of people actually include them amongst the Homo sapien, which is not so true when you go back to Last Lucy, etc.
Yeah, people would like to make Neanderthals part of normal humans because they do have certain characteristics that are human-like. They do bury their dead. At least they have. There are cases where they buried their dead. But please, if you have these intermediate crosses, there's got to be some humanity in there. And the great question, I think, is, did Jesus die to save this creature? And that's the problem, I think, that God is confronted with when he looks on this mixing of genes from chimpanzees and humans, or whatever the original animal might have been. How do you decide whether this person is somebody Jesus died for or not? And that's really the fundamental question. There are animals that bury their dead. There are animals that mourn over their dead and have funeral services. Even races, there's some, but that doesn't mean Jesus died for them. And so I think this is an important question, and I don't know that we can answer it, but I do think that we do not have people today on the earth that are of this character. I think whenever God put an end to this kind of thing, it hasn't continued on. That's my own conjecture.
Yeah, I'm just following on from what Warren was saying. If there are post-flood, and there are obviously significant numbers, So if these are post-flood and they are significant numbers, then except that you would like to believe that they're not actually mixing with general humans and there are sort of then that potential gradation,
Yeah.
there's really nothing to suggest that there wouldn't be. That's what concerns me about the hypothesis overall.
No, I think God put an end to it. I don't know how or when.
Yeah.
But if this is what caused the flood to begin with, he would have had to put an end to it.
Yeah.
I think, just trying to respond to that question. There is a text in Genesis which suggests that there was some kind of a try to do that. This is in chapter 6, when the sons of Cain, they tried to. And the phrase which is used there suggests that they were taking just anything. And God then immediately interrupted
Before the flood.
the experiment.
Yeah. Yeah. I acknowledge it's conjectural, but I think there's a lot behind it. For example, these papers that suggest that it's a viable method of joining humans together.
Yeah. So again, if it was before flood, you sort of have, yeah. So you have no problem in terms of God putting an end to that as a result of the flood,
Yeah.
and that all makes sense. Coming after the flood and finding them in obviously numbers big enough in order to find them as fossils.
Yeah.
This is where the problem is in terms of, because we are now talking about the modern era. And so in the modern era, for it to be available, and then, I would probably need, I certainly need a lot more evidence, but that's...
Yeah, I don't know. I'm presenting the data and then making an inference about the data based on what I think are reasonable presuppositions. But I'm not arguing my point. I'm not trying to defend it. I'm putting it out there for you to look at. And I'm trying to fill in some of the gaps. But if you want to take it away, that's fine. Give me a better model. I'd love to have a better model, yes.
For what it's worth, regarding the antediluvian fossils, Ellen White makes a statement that they were buried deeply so that they're not available.
Yeah, I concur with that. I think God had good reason for getting rid of them. And for example, the discovery of a single fossil of a giant human, for example, somewhere in the fossil record where it doesn't belong, what would we do with that? Well, we'd take it to the evolutionists and beat them over the head with it, right? Isn't that what you do? Well, God doesn't trust us with that kind of data. And Jesus said, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Will we trust in him because of our relationship with him rather than because of some data or other? I think that's a very important principle.
You ask about giant men. There is actually a book available written for North America of all the discoveries which were made in the 18th, 19th century, and some of them they were newspaper reports, and it's all been collated into a book, and some of the material got into museums, but they disappeared about 100 years ago.
It's what we call ark stories. You get right up to finding the ark, and suddenly that's the end of it. And so there are a lot of people that chase these things down, and they all end up at dead ends. So to me, that's a way of saying that we're not going to be able to find that. We're not going to be able to base our faith on absolute, incontrovertible data. We have to make decisions based on the Word of God and do the best we can with it.
So I had a question for Dr. Dukan in regards to the fourth day of creation. So the question was, or is, in terms of the greater light and the lesser light, why are there days regulated prior to the fourth day of creation? Sorry, just right here.
Okay,
why are there days that are regulated prior to the fourth day? And then also at the end of the fourth day of creation, it says, and the stars were created also. Is that implying outside of our solar system, and how much of that is, how do we read that text correctly?
If I understand your question well, you are talking about, where does the identification of the day, evening and morning begin, right? Am I understanding that question?
yeah,
That's
so
the
that
way
was
I
the
should understand your question?
Yeah, that was the first part, and I guess I was just trying to understand the intent of what God was trying to communicate in terms of the day starts at the evening and then the morning, but then
Okay.
the days that, or the sun and the moon that regulate the days are created on the
Right.
fourth day.
Well, the question is short, but the answer should be much longer than the question, I suppose. So, but anyhow, we have the only time where we are sure about Erev Boker, that means evening and morning, is on the fourth day, of course. I mean, the evidence, immediate evidence, logical evidence that we have evening and morning connected to the sun, the way we understand it. I mean, the way it's a part of who we are. But what the interesting thing is that from, let's say, a point of view of the writer, from the point of view of the writer, the written thing, is that the phrase which is used in connection to the sun, the separation of darkness and light, of night and day, the whole, there is a stylistic expression, a very specific expression, technical expression, which is exactly the same, for the first day when God initiated the whole process of the days, of the week. That suggests clearly that the process you describe in connection to the sun on the fourth day is happening already on the first day, but God is the subject of the verb. See, that in other words, this is clearly indicating that the solar day, which you have in the fourth day, is already taking place on the first day, although the sun is not functioning then, right? That would be something. Now, something to be added to that. I mean, if I understand the second aspect of your question, why do we have a beginning of the day beginning in the evening and not in the morning? Is that part of your question also? Am I right?
Not particularly, but it's an interesting thing that you've brought up.
Okay, you are taking advantage of my mistake. Okay, so, it is clear that the day, there is a debate about the beginning of the day, whether it is in the morning or it is in the evening. In ancient Egyptian, the day begins in the morning. Generally, in the ancient East, the day begins in the morning. This is kind of a very exceptional case that we have in the Bible, the day beginning in the evening. This is really striking when you compare with these other things. And this is clearly the case, because the way it is, the way it is written, you have God separate the day, the night, the light from the darkness, and then there will be an evening. That's clearly the evening comes out of the darkness, comes really after everything was, let's say in the beginning, darkness. Then God creates, I'm just following the sequence without really making any kind of analysis. You have everything, darkness everywhere. Then God creates light. Then he separates, after this creation of the light, he separates light and darkness. And when you hear darkness, immediately after that, there is evening and morning. Now, that suggests clearly to me, when you are used to the way the Hebrew language is functioning, always the antecedent prevails. In other words, since you have darkness immediately before the evening, then he separated light from darkness, evening, morning. So you have the evening, morning coming out of that separation. Right? It doesn't. So now, the way I interpret that, to come back to the other question, why is it that really the day, this kind of this exception, the creation day begins in the evening while we are sleeping, just as God creates Eve while Adam is sleeping. There are all kinds of reasons you can infer from that. But what is interesting, without getting into the humorous aspect of it, but which exists also, it is interesting that God creates when in the other cultures, creation takes place when we
are awake, when we are standing. It begins when we begin our day. Creation begins in the other culture, in the ancient Near Eastern culture, which suggests that for them, creation takes place at the same time as myself. In other words, it is something which is a part of my life. In the context of the Bible, from the biblical point of view, God creates while we are not in action, when we cannot even contribute to that, and that maybe suggests an interesting lesson, that has to do with the fact that it's a grace. God works for you. You are not a part of it. Creation that is not a process which starts with man. Man has not a part of it. That may be a lesson. I'm just because it's not explicit, but that may be a lesson. You are not humans. The way creation does not accompany our rhythm. It's something which takes place apart of us. That would be the lesson, and that's why in the evening and not in the morning.
And
okay.
Sorry, I realize I'm hijacking Q&A time. So the part about the stars being connected to the fourth
I'm
day.
trying to see the.
Oh, never mind.
Sorry. Well, all right. So it's a little confusing with this thing, right? Well, the stars, the moon, and the sun. When you read the text, the syntax suggests that they have already been recreated before even, the beginning of creation. It's like a parenthesis. God created, and by the way, also it has been good. So the syntax is clearly suggesting that this is something which already. What happens? There is no creation of the sun and the moon and the stars. You don't have the same thing. What you have there, which is created, is the function. That's the only place where really explicitly we can talk about God creating a function and not creating a matter. When you have creation of the light, Vayehi, or he created the light. He didn't create the function, but he creates the function on the fourth day, the function of the sun and the moon. The same function is held by God on the first day.
All right, here's another question. Is there, here you are.
Professor, thank you for your presentation. Could you please comment on Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2? The earth was without form and void, and then the creation of the first day of the week, the time period between
Could you identify yourself? Sorry, I don't see you.
So here.
I need to see the face. Sorry.
Right. Yeah,
Okay,
so Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2,
right.
The earth was without form and void, and then the creation of the first day of the week, the time period between that time. Is there any evidence of how long that would have been?
There is no, in my view, the only gap I see between those two verses is the gap between the writer and the reader. That there is no, because the text does not suggest any kind of gap between verse 1 and verse 2. Actually, there is a very strong connection between verse 1 and 2. Which is suggested. Whether you read it as in a construct, which I tend to do that for a number of reasons. That is, in the beginning of the creation by God of heavens and earth, that the earth was so and so. God said in one single breath. So that's the strong. There is a strong evidence to that reading. But or if you read it in the traditional way, which you have in new versions, that is, in the beginning God created heavens and earth. By the way, the earth, and then you have the focus, the earth related to echoing the earth which has just been said. This is the same earth, so you have a connection. So there is no evidence, textual evidence supporting the gap theory, any kind of gap theory.
I want to thank all of you for your questions and the responders for their responses. It is now time for us to take a break, and we'll have some announcements here first, I'm sure.
We're going to take a couple of photos as well after the... Yep, okay. So Liz has got some things to share with us.